I am delighted to be in Berlin, and I want to thank the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab for inviting me to participate in what is truly a unique summit. I've had many titles throughout my career, and I've also been called a few names, some of them flattering, some of them not so much. But after participating in yesterday's geolocation challenge, I can add the other of being a digital Sherlock. So I consider this quite an accomplishment because in case you didn't notice, I actually belong to a slightly different generation than most of you. I actually tell my students that I went to college sometime between the invention of the iPad and the discovery of fire. But to prove my technological bona fides, I also tell my students that I've been in a driverless car. I have made it a regular habit to visit Silicon Valley for meetings with tech leaders, most of whom are my grandchildren's age. And those visits are not without risks, because during one of my trips to a startup, I actually was run over by a robot. And my grasp of how technology works may be faith-based, but my perception of its impact in international affairs comes from experience. I'm also a professor, and I'm devoted much to my academic career to studying a subject directly relevant to our discussion today and the role of information in political change. My research had in the past focused on the Soviet bloc, a subject which has in recent times really become all too relevant. In the 1970s, I wrote my dissertation on the role of the Czechoslovak press in the Prague Spring. And in the early 1980s, I traveled to Poland to study the underground press of the Solidarity movement. I met with dozens of journalists who told me that while they started out by delivering mimeographed news sheets to workers in factories, they found that they could increase their speed of communication and the reach of their message by using what was then considered a cutting-edge technology, the audio cassette. Because what they could do would be to record Lech Wałęsa in one factory and then send it on to the next one. I remember thinking about those tapes in 2011 as I watched activists in Tunisia and Egypt use social media to organize, communicate, and ultimately topple two entrenched regimes. It was easy in the immediate aftermath of the Arab Spring to believe that these new tools of communication had only transformed politics for the better, and that the spread of Twitter and Facebook would inevitably lead to more open and democratic societies. But as our agenda attests, those views turned out to be too optimistic because, like so many other things, technology is a double-edged sword. In recent years, democracy's enemies have become adept at polluting social media platforms with rumors and disinformation and anti-democratic propaganda. These lies are then used by predatory political movements that violate what we used to consider the acceptable bounds of civic debate, and by political leaders who promise easy answers, exploit social divisions for their own purposes, and utter falsehoods with every breath. Meanwhile, leaders who play by the rules are having trouble staying ahead of a relentless news cycle and have to devote too much effort trying to disprove stories that seem to come out of nowhere and have been invented solely to do them in. All this does have consequences, which is why people who once heralded the birth of the social media age are now wondering whether democracy can in fact survive it. Wael Ghonim, the blogger who helped ignite the Egyptian Arab Spring, summed up the problem in the following way, and I quote, "While once social media was seen as a liberating means to speak truth to power, now the issue is how to speak truth to social media," unquote. Of course, disinformation campaigns are hardly novel. I regret to say that during the American War for Independence, the rebel minister to Paris, Benjamin Franklin, used his printing press to circulate stories he had made up about British atrocities. And under the communist system I once studied, official news sources were nothing more than mouthpieces for government propaganda. However, just because a technique isn't new doesn't mean that it's not dangerous. The cost of spreading falsehoods through social media is minimal, and so for those who are adept at it is the effort required. The deployment of fact checkers is helpful, but can seem like dispatching a tortoise in pursuit of a hare, and unlike Aesop's, has no intention of slowing down. Having spent the time in Brussels and Berlin this week, I know that member states and the European Union are pursuing a variety of policy initiatives and establishing a framework for the role regulators can play in addressing the challenge. Speaking frankly, Europe is far ahead of the United States when it comes to online protection. Many are predicting that the new General Data Privacy Regulation will over time become the global standard, and Brussels has been at the heart of actions to regulate US-based internet companies. In the United States, two main elements have complicated and slowed similar efforts. First, our current Congress and administration instinctively reject even sensible regulation, and in this case, they can claim rules will stifle the innovation that has made our IT sector the world's most dynamic. Second, the lingering confusion and acrimony over the 2016 presidential election and the ongoing investigations into the nature and scope of Russia's electoral interference have constrained official efforts to stop disinformation. I've been concerned for some time about the disinformation issue turning into a partisan matter in our country. It is a threat to our democratic institutions, to political parties on the right and the left, and to countries on both sides of the Atlantic. And we can't forget that. We also can't forget that Russia is not the only practitioner of these dark arts. This has become a worldwide threat, with North Korea, China, Venezuela, the Philippines, and Turkey employing squads of opinion shapers to flood online sites. Extremist political movements, including terrorist groups, are engaging in the same practice. So we need a global response that involves governments, civil society, the technology industry, and the experts that build and improve the tools we use. All these players have a role to play in protecting democracy, but the operators of social media platforms have a particular duty to respond and protect their users. The view that these companies have no responsibility for the impact of the content on these platforms is convenient, and when articulated as a way to defend free expression, seductive to many. That approach, however, carries with it the risk that we will fail to address fundamental problems, or, far worse, governments will feel compelled to impose the kind of regulations that may ultimately corrode both democracy and freedom. I believe that there's another path, one that involves closer cooperation between the technology companies and advocates for democracy around the world. As chairman of the US-based National Democratic Institute, I'm involved in a new initiative aiming to forge that type of cooperation. We're calling it the Design for Democracy Coalition. With support from the tech industry, it will bring together key actors in the global democracy community, including political parties across the ideological spectrum, parliamentary monitoring organizations, civic tech partners, and election monitors. Our aim is to make it easier for these groups to engage and coordinate directly with technology firms and vice versa. This will help democracy advocates and practitioners access the latest tools and best practices for responding to disinformation. And done right, it will also help the technology community to understand and move earlier to resolve democracy-related problems on their own platforms. When stronger advocacy is needed to push technologies companies to do what is in the best interest of democracy and the long-term health of their platforms, the coalition will be able to do so through a more coordinated and united front. The coalition will complement the important work that other organizations, including the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab, are what we're doing to expose and fight disinformation. So as this conference proves, there is an emerging network of technologists, democracy activists, and policy experts, many drawn from countries on the front lines of the disinformation battles. It's important for this network to grow wider and to grow deeper, because what we've witnessed in terms of disinformation thus far, I have to say, is just beginning. It's becoming almost simple to generate products that show people, including politicians, doing things they didn't do and saying things that they never said. Artificial intelligence and machine learning are also making it easier not only to distribute messages to targeted audiences, but also to generate content that is highly targeted to individuals based on their personal data. Imagine a foreign agent creeping into your bedroom every night to whisper lies into your ear, and then multiply the number of agents and lies many times over. If a lie is repeated 10 times, it can be corrected. If a lie is repeated thousands of times, its risks become accepted truth. We need to understand the kind of danger that all this represents. And after all, without respect for truth, there would be no civilization. And that's why even the first law codes in ancient Babylonia included penalties for perjury and bearing false witness. Truth-telling is the basis of social compacts and business agreements. It is the key to honorable relations between people and nations. It is essential to prove a point, educate a child, or provide the foundation for government of, by, and for the people. It is also our most potent weapon in the fight against dictators and despots. We need to remind ourselves constantly that there's a reason we believe in transparency, while authoritarians do not. We have an interest in objective facts because they are, more often than not, on our side. But we also need to remind ourselves that there's nothing new about the basic challenge of adapting institutions to keep pace with change. Thomas Garrick Masaryk, the first president of the country where I was born, Czechoslovakia, used to marvel at the transformation in public habits and discourse created by the invention of the Sunday newspaper. Radio became an unprecedented political tool in the hands of Franklin Roosevelt and Adolf Hitler. Television brought graphic images of war, poverty, and famine into our living rooms for the first time. Now, we find ourselves facing a new era with new tools that have the power to spread information across the landscape with unprecedented speed and scale. We have no choice but to accept that challenge and to explore together, as we are doing in this conference, how best to work together for the common good. And in that effort, I hope we'll bear in mind that although we live in a world of change, what matters most must not change. And that is our basic commitment to democratic values, our respect for one another, and our commitment to justice and dignity of every human being. And if we abandon those principles, we will lose our way. But if we hold them tight, we will not go wrong. So my thank you once again for all your kind attention this morning. And now I look forward to our discussion and answering questions. So, Graham?
So, Madam Secretary, we've turned it over to the app because it's digital. And the first question and I should say this, as a general matter, we're against anonymous online activity, but these questions are from the audience and they're anonymous. So the first question is social media compatible with democracy?
I do think that social media is compatible with democracy because information is compatible with democracy. But I think the question really comes down to where is the information coming from? And we do know that social media has a characteristic in some ways of being an echo chamber, which requires us to listen to more than one news source or social media. And one of the things that I've been talking about more and more is the need to I don't like the word tolerance because it comes from tolerate, put up with, It is more to respect the opinions of others, and therefore it's important to listen to them. You should all be very glad that you don't live in Washington, D.C., where I drive, and listen to right-wing radio as I drive, and yell a lot and have various hand motions. And at some point, something terrible will happen. But it really is an attempt to understand that you need to listen to more than one force of social media, and to take it in a way where you are learning and respecting what others are thinking. So I actually think that it's compatible with democracy.
And I know that you may or may not have recently wrote a book about this, but what are some of the history lessons that we should remember when we're challenging, or when we're dealing with the specific challenge of disinformation?
Well, let me say, I did write a book which has kind of a bland title. It's called Fascism, A Warning. And it's also got kind of a quiet cover, red and black. But I think that the lessons that come out of that, and my book has a lot of history in it, is that there are divisions within our societies that in many ways are exploited by leaders with different intentions in terms of really disaggregating voices and aggregating them again in a way to set one group against another. So there are historical lessons, and I think that the lesson, and this is why I think it is essential, and why I talked about the combination of democracy and social media, is that as I studied the book, research for the book, Mussolini and Hitler both were given power constitutionally. Mussolini by King Emmanuel in Italy, who was feeling weak and asked Mussolini to take over. And von Hindenburg in Germany, who also was feeling weak during the Depression in a variety of ways, and turned power over to Hitler. The other countries that I study, which are Turkey and Hungary and Poland, in the Philippines and Venezuela, all had elections, elected their authoritarian leaders in a way. And so therefore, the question is, how is democracy used in order to undermine democracy, and how the tools that we have are a double-edged sword, and that's, we need to learn which edge we use.
One of the things that we talk a little bit, we have time for one more question, and one of the things that we talk a little bit about at the DFRLab is we only use open source because it builds back trust. So the question is, how can democratic governments restore credibility as a reliable source of information in the eyes of their citizens? How do they build back trust in this particular moment with something like as pervasive as disinformation?
Actually, it helps that they don't lie to the people. I do think that that is an important part, is you wouldn't think one had to say that. But the bottom line is that it is up to the government to let people know what the facts are. They may not always be pleasant, and they may be, I would hope, that they would be accompanied by some solutions to the problems, but we really do have that issue. And some of you have heard me say this, and I keep repeating it because I really do think that it describes things very well. When I went to Silicon Valley, this was the line that I heard, which is that people are talking to their governments on 21st century technology. The governments listen to them on 20th century technology and are providing 19th century responses, which means not so much that they are lying, but that they are not, the governments, in tune with what is going on. And what has to happen is, in fact, that the social contract needs to be refurbished in a way where the government understands their responsibility towards people who have given up some of their individual rights in order to live in a society that protects them. And so that trust, if they're not providing the answers or they're not doing anything, then it undermines everything. And I have to say, the part that I have, some of you know, and I stated it, I'm a naturalized American. I'm wearing the Statue of Liberty today for a reason, because I do believe that the inspiration of America is to be diverse and have a variety of people there, but also the government that we have was set up in a way to protect democracy. But they actually have to do something rather than have gridlock and blame each other for things that each one is responsible for. So I do think that the governments have to restore trust, but they also have to deal with today's problems and not ones that they make up or are 19th century ones.